Thank you very much. And never did I think that I'd be hosting a panel on regulation. It just goes against really everything that I believe in. I think just to start off, some quick introductions. So I'll start off. I'm Neu-Ner, or you probably know me as Crypto Man Run. I'm a fund manager. I also host the world's only televised crypto show on CNBC. It's called Crypto Trader. I think I'll hand it over to you guys. Yusuf, if you want to start.
Yusuf Hussain, head of risk at Gemini Trust Company, also the president of the board of the Virtual Commodity Association. Spent most of my life career at Goldman Sachs within the risk function, and prior to that, Ernst & Young, so risk through and through.
But Yusuf, risk sounds like really boring. And I've been speaking to you for a while now, and you're not like a really boring guy. How did you get into risk?
You need to be somewhat of an exciting personality in order to get into something somewhat boring. You know, what it is, the 2008 financial crisis was a very exciting time, and it brought birth to a number of different risk professionals. So there was a little bit of adrenaline during that time, and helping figure out, implement appropriate checks and balances, so that something like that, to that extent, doesn't happen again.
Maria, tell us a little bit about what you're doing.
Hi, I'm Maria Filipakis. I am a managing partner of a company called the Topside Group, and we provide regulatory advice to all sorts of companies across the financial services sector. I'm currently the executive director of the VCA, so I get to work with Yusuf and others on a daily basis. And before that, I'd been in government for about 17 years. I was a regulator in New York State and worked at the New York State Department of Financial Services.
Wow.
Really exciting job.
Wow.
You got quite the panelists up here.
I have indeed. So let's talk about the Virtual Commodity Association. I mean, first of all, I want to know what it does. And second of all, I want to know why you've called digital assets commodities.
Sure. I'll take a stab at that. So the Virtual Commodity Association was formed by 4 US-based exchanges with common goals around self-regulation for the industry. It came about based off of requests, call to actions by US regulators like the SEC and CFTC, and we have a number of different committees within the Virtual Commodity Association that are a direct answer to the SEC and the CFTC that span across things like market surveillance, custody, and I'm sure we'll get some time to go into those in some depth. Why are they called the commodities? The CFTC had deemed Bitcoin a commodity a number of years ago, and the SEC in a general speech indicated that they felt that Ethereum was also considered a commodity and not under SEC purview. There's always been a rift between what is a security, what is a commodity, so we've taken that stance that most of what we trade are considered commodities.
Under the assumption that there are commodities, I mean, you're talking about the CFTC and you're talking about the SEC, but then when we talk about the tax authorities, IRS, as a commodity, every time we transact in Bitcoin or ETH, essentially we're subject to a capital gain.
Right, that's right. And a number of things that, as I mentioned, a number of different committees that we're implementing. I mentioned market surveillance, I mentioned custody, but one of the big committees is taxation. How do we work with the IRS? How do we formulate taxation rules that make sense for the commodities space, the digital asset space? Commodities is a starting point for us. At some point in time, as there's more regulatory certainty from the federal regulators as to what is and is not a commodity, that'll help us inform better rules and regulations.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important. Yusuf touched on the fact that we also have a tax group, but just to kind of give you a sense, we early on defined what we thought were like the really interesting topics for just the marketplace, right? Sort of depending on who the regulator is, and for the community itself. And so, in addition to like market integrity and tax and BSA AML, we created a custody security, right? Cybersecurity focused working group, one on enforcement, and then one on insurance as well, right? So we kind of think that these are really, really interesting areas that we think, even if the name of the entity is the VCA, that all regulators would have a real interest in these kind of identified work streams.
Okay, now, I mean, let's talk about why there is even a need for a self-regulating body. I mean, the US has amazing laws. In fact, I've just moved to the US, and the one thing I can tell you about the US is that it's well over-regulated and well over-enforced, which is quite a bad combination. Why is it that we need self-regulating bodies? Why are the current regulations not enough?
Yeah.
I'll jump in after you.
Yeah, definitely jump in. The motto of the VCA, if you will, is sensible, thoughtful regulation. Yes, the U.S. may be considered over-regulated and heavy on regulation. The rules that were written, the Securities Exchange Act, the Investment Advisors Act, were all written in the 1930s. You've got BSA AML rules and regulations that were written in the 70s and 80s. And as the financial markets matured, when there were traders screaming and yelling, executing trades in the pits, to executing trades over the phone, to electronic trading, to high-frequency trading. This is yet another maturation of the markets. So the idea here is and throughout the maturation of the financial markets, regulations, those 1930s, 70s regulations were amended. There was a lift and shift sort of mentality. It was trying to square peg round hole or round peg square hole. I don't know how the saying goes, but the VCA, what we're trying to do is figure out what is the most thoughtful, sensible way to enforce regulation within the crypto space. It's transforming the entire financial markets, and success is appropriate adoption of blockchain technologies.
But how much weight, Maria, do self-regulation bodies actually hold? I mean, ultimately, the US and specifically the SEC and the CFTC, those guys are very much around, their own set of rules. And here we are as a self-regulating body. How much weight and how much respect do the regulators have for self-regulating bodies?
Oh, I think quite a lot. I mean, if you look at, for example, the NFA is an SRO, the National Futures Association, right? And the main regulator there is the CFTC. But there was a time, if you really sort of think about how did they come about, there was an increase in futures contracts. There was a lot of options trading going on, and there was still a fair amount of confusion in the market. And when this SRO came about, the NFA, it really kind of provided clarity and assistance, I think, to those in the market and to the regulator. So here's what happens when you say SRO, right? People have two reactions. One is...
Just for the audience here, what is an SRO? I mean, you're rattling it off like... Anyone know what an SRO is? I don't.
Yeah. There you go.
All two of them.
Pretty good. All two.
I think there's a lot of people who probably have some experience or know, right? But it's a self-regulatory organization, and usually you need some kind of act, like to be a legislature or statutory or regulator to be basically to sponsor it, right? To put it through. And when people often talk about self-regulatory organizations, they kind of think two things, right? One, predominantly, you're trying to find a way of avoiding regulation, right? You're looking for the end run in some way to maybe, have it be less. The other, though, which I think is what we really think, is, look, you can supplement it, right? To your point, there's a lot of regulation out there, and there's some already existing in the space, right? But if you have an SRO, it kind of, and particularly in this space that we're talking about, the message you're sending to the regulator and the market and investors is like, look, we're really mature. We get that there might be some gaps. We want to bring comfort to everyone in the space, right? And we're there to kind of supplement and clarify. So we're sort of more of the experts. You are all kind of on the front end of this, and we can kind of see developments in the marketplace way before anyone, so we can sort of get to the regulator, right? Because guess what? If you don't, regulation is going to come, and if we have at least a say, or we've got some input in that, isn't that more of what you want than not?
But don't we have other self-regulating bodies, like the Chamber of Digital Commerce, for example, which are based in Washington?
Right.
Aren't there other groups that are doing this? And I mean, I think that the big question is, do we need another group?
So that's actually a really good question. That question gets asked quite a bit.
Yeah.
So what I like to do is tell a little story about the analogs and the parallels in traditional financial markets. So in traditional financial markets, if we look at the securities and equities world, right, you've got the SEC in the US, that's a regulator. You've got FINRA, which is the self-regulatory organization acting on behalf of the SEC. You've got SIFMA, which is the lobbying association. You've got a number of different think tanks. You've got international standards organizations like FATF, like ISO. There's no shortage of associations within the traditional financial industry that do each do their own little thing within the ecosystem. So Chamber of Digital Commerce is a good example. They play in that lobbying space, that think tank, that lobbying space to help educate regulators. The VCA, the Virtual Commodity Association, is the only association that's looking to become an SRO. And to further build upon what does it mean to be an SRO, a number of conversations that we've had with regulatory authorities in the U.S. Have focused on key topics like market surveillance, like custody. But also, one question we always get asked is, how are you going to enforce? And that's a key question that a lot of regulators ask us. And one of the committees that we have within the Virtual Commodity Association is enforcement. How do we set up examinations for members? What are the rules that we're going to judge them against? Just like FINRA, just like NFA, looking to create that same sort of model, but make it purpose fit for crypto.
Okay, who's funding the VCA? What are the funding requirements? How many people work there currently full-time? Give us a sense for the scope of this organization and therefore probably the credibility of the organization.
Sure. So there's 6 committees. Each of those committees are led by 1 to 2 subject matter experts from traditional financial industry. So we've got representatives that, for a good example, is the former director of enforcement at the SEC leads our enforcement committee. We've got a major subject matter expert firm called Navigant that's running advisory across all of our streams. We've got big name consulting and law firms providing expertise within the other committees. So we've got about, I would say, 6 to 12 committee leads. We've got about, within each member, we've got 4 members. 4 members are going to be...
Are these full-time people, or are these people that have other roles and are coming in on, in the evenings and every now and then?
These are dual-purpose, dual-headed individuals that have expertise, whether from traditional finance or from crypto. So we do have a cadence, right, for ensuring that we've got work products that are going to be set forth, deliverables that are going to be set forth. Anything else that I think...
Yeah, so there are basically like 4 members, as sort of Yusuf mentioned. There are 4 exchanges. They have a U.S. presence, right? So there's a U.S.-based operation there. That's a little, right now, currently, that's a membership requirement. But obviously, if people are sort of interested in getting more information, they definitely reach out to Yusuf and I to get more detail. It's funded by membership dues at the moment. We've got a board. And as Yusuf said, we have these committees that we've kind of put together, and they're really kind of subject matter experts. Lots of them are former regulators, people that have got real experience, I think, in the space, and they're dual-hatted. But yeah, we talk to them not just in the evenings. Right?
Yep. And you reminded me, actually, that I think another thing that sets the VCA apart is that we actually do have the blessing of the CFTC. They have publicly made statements in support of the Virtual Commodity Association, support the SRO initiative. If there was a regulatory authority that would put us in front of Congress and pass an act of legislation to designate us an SRO, it would most likely be the CFTC. Additionally, the FIA, which is the lobbying association for the futures market, had a congressional hearing maybe a month or 2 ago, which I thought was interesting. They were looking to reauthorize the CFTC, and amongst the many other things that they wanted to reauthorize the CFTC on, one of the things that they highlighted was the need for self-regulation within the crypto spot market. And in speaking with the FIA, they had indicated that they were saying the VCA without saying the VCA, so we've got tremendous support from the commodities world, regulators, and the lobbying organizations there.
So that's the story for self-regulation. Let's talk about non-self-regulation, government regulation. What is it that's keeping the US government from regulating this industry? Is it the fact that they truly believe that the current regulation is good enough? Is it that they don't know enough regulation? Or is it that our market currently is just too small and insignificant for them to want to regulate?
I mentioned before that there's a lot of emphasis put on educating the regulators. This is nascent to them. It's a new technology. It's a new industry. They're trying to figure it out. I think they recognize that regulation coming from the regulators can't move at the speed of innovation. And they're looking for sensible, thoughtful regulation. And what that requires is not only folks that come from traditional financial regulatory backgrounds or financial industry,
right,
but also subject matter experts within the crypto industry to inform regulation that works.
Are they taking too long, do you think? I mean, you're risk and compliance people. Let's put you guys in the risk and compliance department, but of the regulator, and say, have they taken too long, or are they taking too long to regulate, or have they in fact been responsible by not regulating yet and letting this industry just continue a little bit forward before they actually pass regulation?
Well, that's actually really funny, because it's probably like one of the first few times I get the question of, do you think they're taking too long to enter a space, right? I think others will say they jump in too quickly. It's always a little bit like, is it too cold or is it too hot? I think in this instance, there does exist regulation, right, on the state level, and others will say it's there. But to the point where you want to enhance it and others can kind of step in, I think there are many in the market that probably want more clarity by some of the, particularly the federal players, sooner rather than later. And that's a little bit of why I think we thought that it made sense, and why the push towards at least ultimately having an SRO is sort of a good thing, to be able to kind of educate and fill in those gaps. So to the degree that there's questions by some of the regulators, right, you can get those answered, and you can kind of move ahead, I think, a little sooner rather than later.
Yep. And you know what's interesting, by frame of reference, the NFA, the National Futures Association, it took about 5 to 7 years for them to be designated an SRO by the CFTC in the 1970s, right? We're
trying to do it quicker.
And the interesting thing is the CFTC has indicated that we move at a fast clip, the industry moves at a fast clip, and they wouldn't be surprised if we were able to get self-regulation in order well ahead of that.
Now,
yeah.
I want to talk to you about the concept of self-regulation versus or balanced against human greed. Now, you mentioned that there are 4 bodies or 4 organizations that started this, and they're all exchanges, and naturally exchanges are for-profit organizations, and in this industry they're very much for big-profit organizations. We saw how we couldn't self-regulate when it came to ICOs. We did a very poor job of self-regulating, and as a result we destroyed any chance of the ICO market ever recovering. Then ICOs moved to this thing called the IEO, and now we've put that in the hands of exchanges, and if you look at the activity that's happening with the exchanges, you realize that the IEO market is about to explode and never to be returned. What makes you think that a body funded by these 4 organizations and others who are greedy, naturally greedy as entrepreneurial people, can self-regulate?
So we have the option here to either let the markets run themselves into the ground, right, or apply sensible regulation, where if we offer the same consumer protections afforded to consumers that they see in traditional financial markets, we would see the big institutional investors come in. These are the very same regulators.
Would the institutions come into a self-regulated market? I mean, let's imagine the pension fund manager standing in front of his board saying, I entered the market, and the board says, yes, but you entered an unregulated market, and he says, yes, but it's a self-regulated market. I mean, I can't see that they're passing the litmus test.
Right. So that's exactly the case with broker-dealers today with FINRA. They're self-regulated by FINRA. FCMs are regulated by the NFA. It is a very similar model. So it's like we almost have the answer book there with how it worked with FINRA and the NFA, and looking to see if we can apply those in a thoughtful way within the digital asset space. And the ultimate goal, going back to your question about exchanges, at the end of the day, yes, profits do matter. However, would we get more profits by looking in the short term and just generating significant amounts of volume in an uncontrolled manner, or do we want to play that long game and grow that market in a sensible manner so that we've got a steady stream, institutions, retail investors, there's things that don't exist in the crypto markets, like insurance, FDIC insurance, SIPC insurance. There's things like lack of clarity around taxation. How do I know that my money's being held, my digital assets are being held in a secure manner? I know when they are with Bank of New York Mellon or State Street Bank.
But that's regulated.
Yeah,
that's regulated,
those guys are regulated.
That's regulated by government and by government organizations. Yeah, Maria, I see that you're itching to say something.
Yeah, I know. Well, I think it's really about, is your interest in the market and your vision short-term or long-term, right? And if it's long-term, then at least you want to have a shot at the conversation that you were talking about, right? If you want the pension fund manager to be looking at the board and discussing whether or not that's an area they want to have an investment, then you really want to see a maturation of this market, right? And like I said, there's some regulation around it currently. I think that as you see this get more regulated, look, to become an SRO, you ultimately do have to have the sponsoring, or so-called, for lack of a better word, the blessing of a regulator. So the reality is, it's not that you're just like a free-floating spaceship when you become an SRO. You do have, essentially, right, you're kind of tied to, or you're working with a regulator. And that is going to carry a lot more weight, right?
Okay, now, you guys must have a to-do list that is longer than, than the unread messages that I've got on Telegram, or you actually probably have a to-do list longer than my shitcoin list, the shitcoins that I'm holding.
I don't know how long your list is, but
my shitcoin list is very, 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 very long.
You're playing the long game.
We'll take that.
I'm playing the long game on my shitcoins. What are the top 3 things that you think need to be addressed before the regulator takes us seriously? And I mean, I'm looking at you because I know that you work for a company that's owned by the twins, and they've been trying to get an ETF approved, a Bitcoin ETF approved, and they keep failing. What are the things that you guys want to sort out very quickly?
Sure. So we'll talk about ETFs briefly, right? So ETFs, the reason why the SEC had postponed their decision on ETFs back in the summer of 2018 were concerns around market manipulation, lack of liquidity, and once again, as I mentioned earlier, the VCA is a direct call to action. I think the VCA was established in September of 2018, right around that time where the SEC decided to push out the decisions. So everything that's being done, once again, is being done in terms of consumer protections that'll make the regulators comfortable. The regulators are the very same regulators that we're speaking to.
But consumer protection around what specific? So I think we know in broad strokes what we're trying to achieve. And what are the specific pillars that you guys want to address as pillar 1, pillar 2, and pillar 3?
Sure. I think, and feel free to chime in. Market integrity is pillar number 1, right? That's going to get significant amount of attention. This is similar to FINRA. Not to get too technical, but getting end-of-day trade files for purposes of cross-market surveillance, right? There is no cross-market surveillance that's happening right now. Each exchange, and unlike the traditional financial markets, if you want to buy Nike stock, you can only buy it on the New York Stock Exchange, right? However, in the crypto markets, you can go ahead and buy Bitcoin across a plethora of exchanges.
So end-of-day market integrity, what else?
I was going to say, just to kind of go off of Yusuf's point, that's a really big one for regulators, right? Because that's where they feel there's a real lack, right, of regulation or any kind of mechanism in place to be able to do that. So it's not just you've got consolidated audit trails, but when you've got these kind of mechanisms for cross-market surveillance, you can also detect market manipulation, right? So the concern that regulators have about spoofing or other sort of fraudulent behavior in the market, that's a real big one to be able to do that, right? Cybersecurity, control, right, custody and security. Having both the regulator and the market feel like there's more mechanisms in place. And look, there's an entire summit here really kind of focused in on discussing like the latest that's out there and trying to provide that kind of security, right, embedded in making sure that, that things aren't hacked and that there's a real sort of, right, essentially kind of mechanism in place to do that. That brings comfort again, right, to both consumers, right, who want to like essentially have companies hold their custody of their wallets, and also to the regulators, right? So cybersecurity, right, and custody, important issue number 2.
And then number 3, enforcement. As I mentioned, a lot of regulators, we are going to be an extension of the regulator.
Right.
It's not that we're going to be doing this independent of the regulators. The regulators are looking to see how do we apply our subject matter expertise and how do we enforce these rules and regulations.
There we go.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We're all out of time. Thank you.
Thank you all.